I come to the floor this evening to join my colleagues to express my deep concerns about the Trump administration's extreme decision to take away services that millions of families and small businesses rely on. This is a decision that does not lower costs, it does not create jobs, it does not enhance public safety or keep our communities safe. It's a decision that actually will hurt people in my state of New Hampshire and too many across the country who rely on services that are now in jeopardy. On Monday night, more than 2,600 federal programs were ordered to cease activities with less than 24 hours notice. They were given little guidance on how this should be carried out. And in every state across the country, confusion and panic among too many people followed. Since that order, I've heard from countless Granite staters who are worried about what this means for them and their families, from healthcare providers to nonprofit organizations to so many who are doing essential life-saving work. Many of these organizations are waiting on promised funding for projects that they've already completed. Funding that they went through the process, they were guaranteed they were going to get these awards, and now they're in jeopardy. The Trump administration claims it wants to lower costs for folks. Well, let me be clear. This unprecedented decision does nothing to bring down the price of food, the price of housing, the price of childcare, the price of medications, or other life-saving needs that families have. So what we saw this afternoon is that the administration tried to walk back their order. They rescinded the memo, but sadly, uncertainty and confusion remains because the White House says that they rescinded the memo, but the freeze wasn't rescinded. So, like a lot of people in New Hampshire, I'm concerned and I'm frustrated. In my state and across much of the country, there's an affordable housing crisis. Because of the administration action, housing organizations across New Hampshire are not able to use federal funds. I heard from the executive director of the Housing Authority in the city of Rochester. They said they have 170 families who are at risk of being homeless if they can't get their operating funding. And that's just one housing authority. Despite what the administration said about rental assistance not being affected, at no point yesterday did the Department of Housing and Urban Development say that this money would continue to be available. Housing funding that keeps all these families and hundreds more across New Hampshire in their homes is at risk of being cut off. Yesterday, we also heard from the Mortgage Bankers Association. They were asking for clarity because they couldn't be sure if they could help families complete the purchase of their homes. The person we talked to said, and I quote, "Americans are going to the closing table tomorrow and deserve to know that their loan will close on their home purchase. Without this clear assurance that the federal government will ensure new loans or pay claims under these programs, there will be severe harm to borrowers and disruption to the mortgage market." Well, HUD gave that clarity for single-family mortgage insurance, but not for multifamily properties such as apartment buildings. That affects 20% of the multifamily housing construction across the country. Let me just say that again. It affects 20% of the multifamily housing construction that's happening right now. We're talking about 130,000 apartments nationally that are jeopardized by this administration's actions. Now, we know we need to build more housing. We're already millions of units short of what we need. In New Hampshire last year, for the first time, the average price of a house was over $500,000. And our rental vacancy rate, in a healthy rental market, the vacancy rate is about 5%. In New Hampshire, it's 0.6%. There is no rental housing. And this careless action means higher rents and home prices in the future. Our housing shortage is much of why the most recent point-in-time count for homelessness found it up 18% across the country. We have far too many people in this country who don't have a roof over their heads, and that's especially dangerous during these winter months. Meanwhile, even though 2 weeks ago, New Hampshire nonprofits and state and local governments were awarded more than $14 million to help shelter people and support them, today they couldn't access that money. That means they won't have the funding they need for rent or to get reimbursed for supportive services. And I want to be clear, even after a judge stayed the order, my constituents still cannot access their funding. The presiding officer is a former governor. He knows what that means when people in our states can't get the housing that they're counting on. If they can't get their funding, that means more people are forced to live in their cars on the streets. It means more people can't get the help they need with substance use disorders or finding work. It means more people are stuck without permanent housing. And these are veterans, their families, they're victims of domestic violence. They're all placed at risk because of this order. I heard from one constituent who has a mortgage from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She's owned her home for 20 years now. She's almost at the point where she's paid off that mortgage. But without the mortgage assistance that she gets from USDA, she's worried that she might lose her home entirely. Another of my constituents, Kathleen, lives in housing for seniors. She has debilitating medical issues that make it hard for her to leave her home. She gets all of her food from a local food bank. She called my office because she's worried that if this funding stops, she'll be on the street, and she doesn't know where her meals are going to come from. That's what this order and these cuts are threatening, leaving seniors without a roof over their head, not knowing where their next meal is going to come from. And it's not just in housing that people are concerned. The effects on communities are significant. The chaos of this order is hurting communities that have been promised funding for improvements they've made to their water infrastructure, to their energy use, and even to city parks. So we heard from the town of Conway, which is in the heart of the Mount Washington Valley and the White Mountains. With help from the Environmental Protection Agency, Conway has fixed an aging sewer pipe, their sewer main, to keep sewage from leaking into the groundwater. New Hampshire's really good at working at the local, state, and federal level to address critical infrastructure. This week, Conway received word that, at least for now, they can't get paid, thanks to this order from the Trump administration. Conway's already done the work, they've already paid the contractors, and as of today, they're waiting for reimbursement of about $400,000 from the federal government. And that's a big deal for a town in a rural area that has fewer than 10,000 people. It affects their tax base. And if the federal government doesn't come through with the money that's been promised, then taxpayers in Conway are going to have to make up that difference. It is unacceptable for the administration to suggest that it won't pay this bill, leaving families on the hook for unaffordable rate hikes. I've also heard from one town administrator who's not yet sure how broad the scope of the administration's order is and how it's going to affect their ongoing wastewater infrastructure project that's using a mix of federal and non-federal funds. Their pump station relies on tarps to keep out the elements. The structure and equipment that keep the sewer system functioning face imminent failure. And without the federal funding, which, just to be clear again, has already been committed, there is no way that this town could complete this project, and that the whims of an unconfirmed budget director can create this degree of uncertainty is maddening. I heard from Kristen Murphy, who's with the town of Exeter. She's very concerned about the pause and the impact it will have on energy efficiency funding. The Energy Efficiency Community Block Grant Program was poised to host a presentation in February for resident-owned manufactured housing on funding opportunities for energy efficiency. And that's particularly important for those people who have lived in manufactured housing. And I did when my husband and I were in graduate school. We lived in what we called a mobile home. Now it's manufactured housing. I know how challenging it is to keep them heated and warm and comfortable for the people who live there. And as Kristen pointed out, support for these manufactured housing communities is essential because a greater percentage of their annual income goes to home heating costs than it does for most people. The administration's actions also threaten other projects in Exeter, like a landfill solar array that's currently under construction, improvements to critical stormwater infrastructure, and funding for a multi-generational community center. And there are a dozen other small towns in my state, from Gorham in the northern part of New Hampshire to Keene in the west over the Connecticut River Valley along Vermont, who have made improvements to their parks and community spaces through the Land and Water Conservation Fund. These towns have matched federal funding dollar for dollar to improve quality of life in their communities. And as of today, because of the uncertainty and the way this order is being interpreted, taxpayers are left holding the bag. In the area of child care and nutrition, the chaos and confusion from the White House over the past 2 days has created significant uncertainty for early education programs, and it risks further fueling the child care crisis. And again, like housing, we have a child care crisis in New Hampshire. The cost of child care for the average family, if they have a toddler and an infant, is over $30,000 a year. And while the administration claimed yesterday afternoon that Head Start programs wouldn't be affected, Head Start programs have been frozen out of their payment system. While hopefully that should be been made available again, my office is still hearing reports of system delays and reduced availability that's harming programs. Now, fortunately, the timing of this uncertainty has not disrupted services in New Hampshire so far, but I'm hearing stories of programs in other states that had to temporarily stop serving families because they were not able to access the funds they needed. It's unclear what the impacts of these shifting policies will be on child care and development block grants, which working families rely on to be able to afford care for their children while parents are at work. My office has heard from the Child Care Network Collaborative in New Hampshire with significant concerns that child care providers may be prevented from accessing community development block grant funding that they've already been awarded. These funds are intended for the purchase of a building that will prevent huge rent increases for child care providers and help fuel an expansion of child care in the rural parts of northern New Hampshire. Child care programs are also concerned about the potential impact on other federal programs that the families they serve rely on. For example, while the administration eventually said yesterday that SNAP payments wouldn't be affected, programs are finding it hard to reassure families about whether they will actually get their monthly payments on time, given the disruptions that we've already seen to programs that were not supposed to be affected, according to the administration's own words. So, more chaos and uncertainty. It's why so many of my constituents are telling me that they simply do not trust what they're hearing from the White House. Families relying on programs like SNAP for food and WIC for women, infants, and children to keep from going hungry already struggle to make their benefits last till the beginning of the next month. Any payment delays, even if it's just a few days, will cause needless suffering for hungry children. It's cruel to be putting struggling families through this unnecessary anxiety. And When it comes to law and order, the president often speaks about his commitment to law and order. In 2020, he criticized Democrats who supposedly wanted to defund and abolish the police. And yet here we are with the president stopping federal funds from going to police and law enforcement agencies. And make no mistake, this stoppage could place lives and livelihoods in jeopardy. I heard from Stratford County Sheriff Catherine Moan about how the cutoff of funds will affect them. I live in Stratford County, so I know the sheriff there very well. Stratford County was awarded a $715,000 COPS technology grant to buy much-needed, modern and interoperable portable and mobile radios for first responders. And the U.S. Department of Justice notified the county on Monday that they're going to withhold these funds, forcing the county to place a hold on the order of new updated radios. Now, this may not sound like a big deal to some, but this equipment helps Stratford County first responders protect Granite staters. And if first responders can't communicate it effectively, by definition, they can't respond to emergencies and crimes. When I was governor, we had a horrible shooting in northern New Hampshire. 2 state troopers, a judge, and a newspaper editor were killed. And as they were trying to get the perpetrator, our state police couldn't talk to local police, they couldn't talk to the Vermont law enforcement, they couldn't talk to the Canadians, we couldn't talk to Maine, all of whom were involved in trying to catch the perpetrator because they didn't have the communication, the radios they needed to keep people safe. In the same vein, the town of Newington in the Seacoast was awarded $80,000 to replace 20-year-old radios and technology that can't communicate with modern equipment. The town was on the verge of submitting its invoices to be reimbursed for buying this crucial public safety equipment when the Trump administration stopped the flow of federal funds. If there were an emergency, like a natural disaster or a mass shooter, Newington's police and fire department would not be able to communicate on their current radio equipment to coordinate an effective response with federal, state, and local partners. This lack of coordination among first responders could result in Newington's police or fire department not arriving in time to fight a fire or to rescue people in need of help. The lack of modern radio communications could result in people not getting medical care quickly enough. Again, this is much needed equipment that allows officers to communicate quickly and effectively to not only protect the people they serve, but to protect each other. Thanks to President Trump, Newington is being forced to pause its upgrade of 20-year-old equipment. It should also be noted that the White House payment freeze means that the businesses who sold Newington the radios and associated equipment are not going to get paid in a timely fashion. So let's call it what it is. Stopping funds to law enforcement and first responders puts lives and businesses in jeopardy. It also affects defense contractors. New Hampshire has a strong defense industrial base. We have a lot of companies that do great work to protect our men and women who are serving. And the federal funding freeze is hitting those small businesses and manufacturers who rely on defense contracts to pay their workforce, which is critical to maintaining our national security. For example, the New Hampshire Apex Accelerators program relies on grants from the Department of Defense to help small businesses navigate federal contracting. In New Hampshire, government contracts and subcontracts totaled $4 billion last year. Now, that's not just some number that helps fuel our economy. And for people from big states, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot of money in your economy. But in New Hampshire's economy, that's a lot of money. And it's an investment in our national defense. It's a manufacturing workers' ability to support their families. So let's not lose sight of what and who we're talking about here. The freeze blocks funding under the Defense Production Act, which expands the defense industrial base under national security emergencies. Right now, we have a lot of businesses in New Hampshire who are receiving funding under the Defense Production Act to support their operations. These grants strengthen military readiness and capacity. And in the area of health, this pause will also cause real harm to healthcare providers and patients across our state. Everyone, from our largest hospitals down to individual patients, is reaching out to my office. They're confused and they're scared. The most immediate consequences will be felt by safety net providers like community health centers. They are vital to caring for our most vulnerable populations. Their patients are often uninsured for health care. Sometimes they're homeless. Some of them suffer from substance use disorders or mental illness, and they rely on their community health centers just to get through the day. As much as 50% of community health center funding comes from federal grants, and their operating margins are slim. Lamprey Healthcare in Newmarket, in the southern part of New Hampshire, tried and failed to draw down federal funds yesterday. They have another scheduled drawdown for early next week. This means that Lamprey has a limited number of days before the Trump administration's order limits the services they can provide to the community. Amoskeag Health, another one of our community health centers, provides services in Manchester, our largest city. It would also suffer from a funding pause. 35% of their funding comes from federal grants, and they only have 19 days of cash on hand, which would cover just 1 week of payroll. They're scheduled to get funding on Monday, and that's now in the lurch. Federal funding to train the healthcare workforce is also being threatened. New Hampshire struggles to retain and recruit healthcare providers, and federal funding is critical to ensure we have enough providers in rural and underserved areas. Last week, Elliott Hospital, one of the largest hospitals in the largest city in Manchester, received notice that $3 million in funding for its nursing expansion grant program was put on hold. There are currently 80 potential students enrolled in this program. The program is designed to address the acute nursing workforce shortage by attracting local applicants in the greater Manchester community. The funding freeze now puts that effort in jeopardy. And Coos County Family Health, the northernmost county in New Hampshire, all up along the Canadian border, is another community health center where access to health care can be extremely limited. Patients frequently have to drive hours to get access to some of the most basic services. Coos County Family Health received a planning grant through the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, to establish a rural medical residency program. Just this week, they received their accreditation, which is so exciting. They were so excited, and now the process begins to recruit and retain future doctors. The sole purpose of this program is to train health providers in Coos County, an area that struggles to attract talent. When we train these doctors in rural areas, they're more likely to stay after residency and become core members of the community. Any other week, this would be great news, more doctors to treat patients in need. But today, their future funding through HRSA is at risk, thanks to the uncertainty created by these executive orders. Training doctors to treat sick or injured patients shouldn't be a controversial issue, but according to this administration, it is. Coos County Family Health also uses federal funding to support the victims of domestic violence that come into their practice. Specialized staff offer the victims counseling and support services, things like access to shelter. The staff connects victims with law enforcement and even offers prevention programs in local schools. Without federal funding, they'll be forced to lay off these staff members. I don't know, does the administration think that domestic violence survivors are unworthy of our support? Does this administration believe that causing chaos is more important than protecting our most vulnerable? Maybe this is what President Trump meant when he said he wanted disruptors. I don't believe this is what the public wanted. Mental health programs are also at risk. New Hampshire's suicide rate is higher than the national average, and we need every available resource to help address this issue. Northern Human Services and the National Alliance on Mental Illness use funding from the Garrett Lee Smith Suicide Prevention Grant to provide after-school support to youth experiencing suicidal ideation or those who have recently attempted suicide. We are literally talking about taking away services from children who are thinking about committing suicide. I heard from the folks at NAMI, the New Hampshire Alliance on Mental Illness. They were almost in tears when they talked about what was going to happen if they couldn't serve these kids who need help. And there's also Navigating Recovery, offering around-the-clock substance use disorder services in the city of Laconia. They're a small nonprofit, and they make use of every dollar they get by offering 24/7 support for individuals that have just overdosed, and that includes literally going into the hospital to be with the patient as they recover. They offer wraparound services like connecting individuals to housing, job opportunities, and childcare so they can find stability as they go through recovery. 53% of Navigating Recovery's funding comes from federal sources, including the state opioid response grant program. I've worked for years to get dollars to the state under that SOR program, including last year when New Hampshire was awarded nearly $30 million. And I have to say, in the first term of the Trump administration, President Trump was very supportive of these dollars. We worked with his administration to get additional funding to address the fact that New Hampshire was one of the hardest hit states. So I don't know why suddenly that funding, they're willing to put that funding at risk by this freeze, because it's done more to prevent fatal overdoses and support recovery services than any other federal program. Navigating Recovery uses those dollars on the ground. Without it, they would only have weeks before they start laying off staff and stop offering services. Despite what this administration claims, it's the individuals who will pay the price of this uncertainty and chaos. This spending freeze is yet another example of the administration ignoring how their policies affect individuals' peace of minds, the livelihoods, and the health of Americans at risk. And then we're seeing broader attacks by the Office of Management and Budget on federal employees. The Trump administration didn't stop at ripping funding away from vulnerable Americans this week. While much of the public's focus has been held by that order, they've continued their relentless attack on federal employees. Over 2 million civil servants working in thousands of essential fields, from healthcare to law enforcement to national security, who keep our country running. They are under attack. And listen, I think we need to be more efficient and more effective, and we may have people who are not doing their jobs the way we want them to. But what this order has done has created confusion over the spending freeze, the hiring freeze instituted by the president's executive order. The administration claims this is temporary, but thousands of Americans who had job offers on the table saw those offers revoked, even those who are ready to fill some of our most urgent vacancies, like at the VA. Even though the Department of Veteran Affairs said it would not apply this hiring freeze to many VA positions dedicated to providing veterans health care and benefits, many crucial programs that veterans depend on will not be able to hire staff to serve our veterans. For example, the VA will not be hiring caseworkers who help veterans get into permanent housing and related support. They won't be able to hire the personnel that literally keep the lights on and buildings running, such as fire protection, housekeeping, plumbing, boiler plant operation, laundry services, and other essential roles. And we should remember that year after year, the VA has had challenges in addressing these critical gaps. Last year, the VA reported almost 3,000 severe occupational staffing shortages, but that didn't stop this administration from pulling every pending job offer the day they took office. And while some have been reinstated, others are still in limbo. In just one example, VA employees at a facility focused on research and care for veterans with late-stage cancer were told their jobs were under review and they may be terminated altogether. Now, I know everybody in this chamber believes that we've made a commitment to those who have served this country in uniform, and we don't want to fail our veterans when they return home and enter civilian life. So, how does this firing the people who take care of them help us fulfill that commitment? And then, if we want to talk about jobs that keep Americans safe, let's talk about keeping planes from falling out of the sky or colliding on runways. I work closely with the National Air Traffic Control Union and the FAA's Collaborative Resource Workforce Group to adopt a new staffing model in last year's FAA reauthorization bill. We have a significant number of air traffic controllers in New Hampshire. They do a great job of keeping people in the flying public safe as they enter North America all the way down to New York and some of the most congested airspaces in the country. Now, the FAA made good progress in hiring last year as a result. There's still more than 3,500 controllers, however, who are short of their staffing target. And the controllers we do have work 6-day weeks, 10-hour days on a good week. They're exhausted, they're overworked, and they face severe mental health challenges as a result. The FAA estimated that 10% of the federal air traffic controller workforce would depart last year as a result of these conditions. And despite this, as air traffic controllers, they still haven't been told conclusively whether or not air traffic controllers are exempt from the hiring freeze. Now, if preventing us from filling shortages and taking care of some of our most vulnerable wasn't enough, OMB is actively trying to get rid of the civil servants we do have. This week, millions of federal employees received emails offering to pay their salaries for the rest of the fiscal year in exchange for resigning now. And that included every single air traffic controller in the country. Now, you might be asking yourself why, when we're short more than 3,500 air traffic controllers, did we offer to pay the ones we have not to work? Well, like the hiring freeze, this order is an irresponsible, reckless, non-targeted effort that could have devastating consequences for critical positions. What's more, they're trying to convince us that this will save money, making it clear that even if we lose thousands of employees with no plans to replace them, we'll be better off. Well, that's bad news for tourism in New Hampshire, for those who work closely with U.S. Forest Service personnel and depend on sound management of the White Mountain National Forest, and it's bad news for people who value clean air and clean water. This message was also sent to more than 780,000 civilian employees who work for the Department of Defense. In New Hampshire, we have almost 8,000 civilians who work at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard that we share with the state of Maine. There are 4 public shipyards in the United States. Our employees in Portsmouth have the best on-time, on-budget record of any of the public shipyards. These employees contribute to the maintenance of our nuclear submarines, an essential tenet of our national security, and a crucial capability to deter major conflict. Any impact to their workforce will strain a shipbuilding industrial base that is already saturated with demand to meet the requirements of our Navy. The bottom line, if the shipyard can't get boats to the fleet on time, our nation is less safe. The freeze on federal assistance also affects critical programs that support men and women in uniform, including DoD's financial assistance and grant programs that support service members and their families. This administration has said repeatedly that it wants to restore the warrior ethos at the Pentagon. I don't know about you, but slashing our defense workforce doesn't help me sleep any better at night. I don't think that restores the warrior ethos. So, in conclusion, I see my other colleagues here, and I know they're waiting to speak. But the actions this week have only created confusion, chaos, and stress. That's the best case scenario if it ends right now. But if not, if the Trump administration and Elon Musk get their way and cut these programs, working Americans will be the ones to suffer the most. The need for housing, sewers, and child care doesn't go away when this administration says they don't want to pay the bills. These costs just get pushed down to towns and end up coming out of people's paychecks. It ends up being paid on the backs of our local taxpayers. Now, again, the administration tried to walk this back by rescinding Monday's memo, but then they added confusion by claiming that the underlying funding freeze was still in place, and they're unable to answer basic questions about who and what will be affected. Maybe it's just me and the hundreds of Granite staters who I've heard from, but if you're going to stop all the critical funding that helps seniors, children, and families across this country, you need a better answer than we're hearing from this White House. Instead, what we heard during the White House briefing when asked one of the basic questions, Americans were told, well, we'll check on that and we'll get back to you. So to Granite staters who have called my office in distress, wondering what this far-reaching, unprecedented move means for their lives and their livelihoods, don't worry, the White House is going to get back to you. That's outrageous. And this despite not one, but two federal judges who have ordered the White House to stop holding these funds. The administration has made it clear that they intend to move forward with vague, irresponsible executive orders that jeopardize billions in infrastructure, energy, healthcare, workforce, and educational investments. Hardworking families, businesses, nonprofits have been calling my office asking for clarity, and this administration hasn't been willing to provide any. Common sense calls for all of us to work on a bipartisan basis to help our constituents, to put an end to the chaos and uncertainty that has been created by this administration in only its second week. I hope we can do that. Mr. President, I yield the floor.